Hi everybody, welcome to the video on section 1.4. This video covers another voting method called the plurality with elimination method. And recall where we've come from. We've now discussed two different methods of declaring a winner in an election. And the first method was the one that you're totally used to. It's called the plurality method. And it essentially just counts the number of votes that each person gets, and the person with the most votes wins. Um, Although in our particular context, we're talking about the number of first place votes. Um, but anyway, it's the method that's currently used in our political system. It's the simplest method. Then we moved on and talked about the Borda method, and the Borda method was a more sophisticated method that used a point system to declare a winner. And the Borda method more fully, more fully let each voter express their opinion. Second place votes really did matter in the Borda count method, as did third place votes. Um, so now we're going to move on to a new method, and it's not a point system. Essentially, what it does is it tries to directly address the drawbacks with the plurality method without using any fancy point systems. And so let me just start with a motivating example. Consider a U.S. election in which this is the result. So maybe this is like a governor's race or a mayoral race or something. So candidate A gets 15% of the votes, B gets 19%, C gets 5%, etc. Right? Notice that, well, what's a fair way to declare a winner is something we'll talk about in a second, but notice that the winner just is candidate D. If this is like a presidential election or a governor election, candidate D got the most votes, the highest percentage, so he wins. Candidate D, though, of course, notice did not get anywhere close to a majority of the votes. Right? He got nowhere close to 51%. He got 21% of the votes. So it's not clear that D really is the best representative of the people's voice. So one way you can answer this question, what's a fair way to declare a winner, or what's a better way to declare a winner, is this. Do a series of runoff elections. What do I mean by that? What I mean is, okay, look at this table. Candidate C got the fewest votes, right? Only 5%. Candidate C is a loser. We should kick him out of the election, right? So we started with 7 candidates. Now let's kick C out and do the election again with 6 candidates. And, you know, these 5% of people who voted for C, um, they may or may not show up again, right? But suppose they all show up and they all like candidate B. Well, now candidate B would jump up to 24%, which would make him better than candidate D, right? But the point is we just don't know until we do the election what these 5% of voters want. Suppose that these 5% of voters all voted for candidate A next, right? So A is now bumped up to 20%. Now we could just do another runoff election, and we would say, look, candidate C has been kicked out. Candidate E only has 7% of the vote. He's a loser, right? Let's kick him out and see where these 7% of people decide to put their votes, right? And you could just keep doing this over and over again until one candidate has a majority of votes. So essentially what you're noticing in this table is the winner that we have does not have a majority of votes, right? That's a problem. We'd like our winner to have a majority of the first place votes. So we just keep kicking candidates out and redoing the election until somebody does have a majority. That's one thing you could do, and I think that might be a fair way of doing things. However, what I just described to you is very expensive and time-consuming and inefficient, right? Imagine actually trying to do this for every mayoral race, city council race, governor race, even presidential race. It would be a nightmare trying to do this, right? So in an ideal world in which everybody has time and the money to do this, it might work. But in reality, this would be a terrible way to do things. Holding runoff elections, and especially a bunch of them, is expensive and time-consuming. One thing you could do, though, is simulate this process. Simulate the process of having runoff elections using preference ballots. Okay, so essentially all that the plurality with elimination method is, it's doing a series of runoff elections without having to actually hold those elections because you have the preference ballots. Okay, so keep in mind that's what plurality with elimination is. There are no points, nothing like that. It's just What if we could hold a bunch of runoff elections and keep running them until somebody gets a majority of the first place votes? That's exactly what plurality with elimination is. So here's a formal description of it, okay? So don't be intimidated by all the text here. The formal description is more intimidating than the actual the method in practice. So we'll do an example in a second here, but here's a formal description of what happens. You start by counting the first place votes for each candidate. If a candidate has a majority of first place votes, so in other words more than 50%, if he has 51% or more, that candidate is the winner. So done. Okay, so if you have a candidate who already has a majority of first place votes, the method doesn't do much. It just declares that person the winner, just like plurality would, right? Just like would normally happen in our current political system. However, if that doesn't happen, otherwise, eliminate the candidate or candidates with the fewest first place votes. So in this example here, nobody has a majority, so we do what I just said, right? C has the fewest first place votes, you would kick him out. So that's what this method says to do. Okay, so you cross out the names of the candidates eliminated from the table and transfer those votes to the next eligible candidates on those ballots and recount the votes. If a candidate has a majority of first place votes now, then declare that person the winner. Otherwise, do what you just did. Eliminate the candidate with the fewest first place votes. It should say here, fewest first place votes. And then just keep doing this until somebody has a majority of first place votes. That person is now the winner. Okay, so again, this is just capturing what it would be like to run, to do a series of runoff elections in which you one at a time eliminate the person with the fewest votes, the fewest first place votes. So here's an example. Okay, so here's a big example with 5 candidates. So the first thing you notice is that A has 93 first place votes, right? These 93 people voted for A. B has 44 first place votes. These 44 people ranked B first. C has 40 first place votes. These 10 people and these 30 people ranked C first. So C has 40 first place votes. D has 42. E has 81. So the first thing you do is you ask, okay, does any candidate right now, I went too far ahead. Does any candidate right now have a majority of votes? Well, no. There are a bunch of votes here. There are like more than 200 of them. So no, right now, nobody has a majority. So since nobody has a majority, what you do is you just kick out the person with the fewest first place votes. Unfortunately for candidate C, that's him, right? So take this 40 and just kick C out. So here's the original preference table, right? Now, C is gone. Well, what happens when C disappears? These 10 people said, this is what the preference ballot means. They said, if C is gone, I'd prefer A, right? Because they ranked A second and C first. So, among other things, what they're telling you is, if I can't have C, I'd rather have A. So when C gets kicked out, these 10 people, their votes are transferred to candidate A. Because presumably, if you did a runoff election with C gone, these 10 people would now vote for A, right? They're telling you that ahead of time. These 30 people ranked C first, right? But what they're telling you, what they're listing here is, they're telling you if C is gone, I prefer E next, right? So presumably, if you did a runoff election with C now kicked out, these 30 people would vote for E. They're telling you that ahead of time with this preference ballot. So what happens? These 10 people, their votes get transferred to candidate A. Right? So candidate A, notice now, has 103 first place votes. These 30 people, their votes get transferred to candidate E. When C is gone, E is where those votes go. That's what the voters would prefer as their next candidate. So here's the status of the election after the first elimination. C is gone, 10 of his votes have gone to A, 30 of his votes have gone to E. So now what you do is, we've now completed round 1. You ask yourself, okay, I've kicked out a candidate and transferred his votes. Does one of the remaining candidates have a majority? does either A, B, D, or E have a majority of first place votes? Well, no. There are 300 votes total, right? I just added them up. So a candidate would need 151 of those to have a majority, right? You need more than 50% of the votes to have a majority. So no, nobody has a majority right now. So that means you're just going to have to do the same thing again. You have to identify the person with the fewest first place votes and kick them out. In this case now, notice D has the fewest first place votes, right? So the next thing we're going to do is kick out D, okay? So now let's come to the column where D is first. These 42 people ranked D first, right? They ranked C second though, so what they're telling you is, well, if D is gone, I would prefer C. But we already kicked C out of the election, right? C is already gone. So now what they're telling you with their preference ballot is, okay, if D is gone and C is gone, then I prefer E. So again, these 42 people, imagine having a runoff election where D is gone and C is gone. They're telling you that they would now vote for E. So what we're going to do is we're going to take these 42 votes and give them to E. So here's the table from the previous slide. These 42 votes that were assigned to D, D gets kicked out. They now go to E, and 111 plus 42 is 153. And now notice, E now has a majority of first place votes. E is the winner. Okay, so that's how this works. So this process that we just did, right, starting back here, simulated doing a series of 2 runoff elections until somebody got a majority. We kicked C out first, right, and then we did a runoff election in which this was the result. A runoff election in which E has 111 votes and A has 103. But after that first runoff election, nobody has a majority of first place votes yet. So we did the same thing. We said, okay, D, you're the loser now. So we kicked D out. And now we got, as a result, after his votes were redistributed in that second runoff election, we now got this result, where E has 153 compared to B's 44 and A's 103. So E is now declared the winner since he is the first person to achieve a majority of first place votes. Okay, so that's how this method works. It's essentially, as I've said many times now, it's simulated runoff elections until somebody gets a majority of first place votes. Okay, excuse me. So here is a variation that happens sometimes in real life. I just wanted to briefly mention it because your book mentions it. Yeah, it's called instant runoff voting, and here's how it goes. You use a truncated preference ballot. So remember what that means. You don't give a full ranking of the candidates. You only give your top 3 candidates or your top 5, whatever. So in this case, you actually do just rank your top 3. And then the process goes much like what we just did. The candidate with the fewest first place votes is eliminated and the votes are transferred. However, there's one important difference, and let me describe it to you right now. Suppose that you voted like this. I want X first, Y second, and Z third, right? Well, when you do plurality with elimination, you start kicking candidates out, right? And then recounting, and then kicking out and recounting. Well, suppose that X has been kicked out, and Y has been kicked out, and Z has been kicked out, right? That can certainly happen that all 3 of those candidates disappear. If that happens, your voice is now gone, right? You have no more votes to transfer. So your ballot essentially disappears, and such votes are called exhausted votes. Nobody on your preference ballot ends up winning, unfortunately. So that's what can happen when you have a truncated preference ballot as opposed to a full preference ballot where you rank everybody. Okay, so this is sometimes used in mayoral races, and example 1.15 gives you an example. So in conclusion here, I want to just say that this method takes some getting used to. My students in the classroom have more trouble with this than with board account. But you just have to do it a few times and make sure you understand what's going on. But after you've done it a few times, it should come more naturally. And again, essentially all this method is doing is taking the plurality method and tweaking it to ensure that somebody gets a majority and that person is now the winner. Right? So if you remember back to when we talked about the plurality method, we had an example of a Maine governor race where a guy won who only got like 38% of the vote. Right? That is not ideal. So what Maine could do is have runoff elections until somebody is the winner. And if they did that, that would be essentially like what we just did with these preference ballots. Okay, so this method is trying to tweak plurality to get it so you don't have this drawback of people with not getting a majority, yet still winning. Okay, so that's all I have to say about plurality with elimination.